Great.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this live broadcast from the Middle East Institute in Washington. We have a really extraordinary panel here today, including two of the co-authors on an important new research paper from Chatham House, The Development of Libyan Armed Groups since 2014, Community Dynamics and Economic Interests. They're going to present the core of their paper, why some armed groups have flourished and others haven't, what's been behind mobilization, demobilization, how the economic elements of that and community elements of that have caused the war to happen. And we're then going to have a presentation by Jason Pack analyzing and discussing the work of the authors Tim Eaton and Abdul Rahman. And then Megan Doherty is going to join us in talking about how this is playing out in the time of the coronavirus and the humanitarian consequences of how this war is playing out. The questions that we're going to try to answer are: what are the possible trajectories of Libya's conflict given the current pandemic? What's the future of Libya's economic system with a crashing price of oil and a likely implosion of the Libyan healthcare system? And how can international actors influence the chances of a sustainable settlement to the conflict? But we're only going to do that in the context of this paper, which has involved extensive research with a lot of the actors. So with that, I'm going to turn to Tim Eaton to begin the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you very much, Jason, and everybody at Middle East Institute for putting on this event. I'm delighted to be here with you in my afternoon, in your morning. As Jonathan's kindly mentioned, the paper that we have released looks at the trajectory of armed groups in Libya since 2014, with a particular focus on their economic activities and their relationship to the communities which they purport to represent. The paper itself is based on around 200 interviews or so with a host of different characters, from black market traders to members of those armed groups themselves. And I should immediately give a shout out to my other co-authors who aren't involved in this event: Mohammed Al-Jarrah and Imad Badi and Valerie Stocker, who also took part in the effort with myself and Abdurrahman. The paper itself focuses on three specific geographic areas: Tripoli, because of its importance to the economic system. We've looked at the east, squarely at the Libyan Arab armed forces of Haftar. And in the south, we've taken a slightly broader view, looking at the plethora of armed groups. We haven't covered Misrata and the Nafusa. We had to limit our scope of inquiry to some degree, and that unfortunately does have some limitations. But really, in the paper, what we've tried to do is challenge head-on this caricature, if you like, that armed groups are responsible for all of Libya's ills, and if only if they were less greedy, less ambitious, that the system would work as it was envisaged. So what I'm going to do in my few minutes is talk through some of the economic structures that we've identified through the paper. And then I'll try and connect a little bit to the current situation at the end and indicate how that may affect and impact the ability of Libya's governing actors to respond to the COVID pandemic. So why do we start from 2014 then? Well, of course, this is because the governance split, and this was a critical time in terms of the economic models of the armed groups. The armed groups themselves had to find alternative means of obtaining revenues in a lot of cases, as their political patrons and the nature of the state system was morphing. If we look in Tripoli, of course, I think it's quite well known that many of the armed groups engaged extensively in the illicit sector. And I'm not going to talk for too long about Tripoli, because I think perhaps this is the best known of our three focus areas. But essentially, what did our research that identify that was a bit different to research up until now? Effectively, what we saw was a shift, a transition from extremely coercive strategies in 2013 and 2014 through protection rackets and forcefully getting on payrolls and these kinds of things, very obviously coercive activity, to much more sophisticated approaches of financial crime through obtaining things like letters of credits and infiltrating state institutions. Importantly, the net result of this is that there's less violence and more security, but there isn't less crime. So there's an important nuance here that this system has a stability. It's based upon a modus vivendi among business actors, among political actors, which enable everybody to get by. And we found in our research that, in fact, in a lot of cases, it was black market traders that had gone to armed groups and sought to work with them. The political actors found ways of coexisting with the armed groups, in some cases being prohibited or prevented from saying too much against their worst activities because they needed them as security actors, but in other cases also being clearly implicated in some of the schemes that they're involved. And here I think it's an important policy lesson, because a lot of the time we're seeking to reduce violence in a political system. And within the Tripoli context, violence was reduced. But the fact that the resources were captured by a limited group of individuals was a driver for other actors outside of Tripoli to contest that order violently, and remains, of course, a justification for the ongoing offensive of Haftar's forces. In the east, clearly the Libyan Arab Armed Forces in this period has developed as the dominant security and political actor in the area. But of course, it's also expanding extensively into the economic realm. It's developed a complex economic model that fuses state and private sector income. On the state side, of course, it receives, or rather its members receive salaries, those who are registered prior to 2014, from the central bank in Tripoli. But of course, in the east itself, or the areas rather under the control of the interim government, the Libyan Arab Armed Forces have supplemented their revenues through taxes collected directly through by the LAF itself and through the interim government. And of course, the Haftar's forces have benefited from the loans and bonds issued by commercial banks to the CBL East. And on top of that, of course, further benefited from the currency which has been printed outside of Libya through a Russian company. And it's worth noting that the CBL East has been critical here, and it says that it's given more than 9.5 billion dinars to Haftar's forces between 2016 and 2018. Importantly, what underpinned this was a quasi-legal framework established by the House of Representatives, the interim government, and the CBL East through the passing of legislation and the establishment of a defense committee expressly for the purpose of funneling funds to the LAF. This legislation from the HOR also gave a legal basis for the establishment of an investment authority, which has grown rapidly and clearly seeks to replicate the Egyptian model. So I think one of the takeaways from this piece of research is that we feel that there's a kind of shadow battle which hasn't received much coverage in the East between civilian and military authorities. And you can see that the pendulum has shifted much towards the military side, although there is still some pushback. We note, for example, that the state of mobilization, when Fajani was talking about using school budgets to go direct to the Haftar's forces, the LAF backed down a bit, but there's still a push. And even in the Corona response, we see directly that the investment authority has sought to respond. And that, I think, indicates the role that the LAF sees for itself in governing the country. In the South, the access to state resources are, of course, fewer. Salaries have been inconsistent to armed groups and often based on old lists, and have run into problems over ID systems and, of course, citizenship disputes. Further to this, of course, the nature of many of those groups in the South is amorphous. So determining what's a regular member and an auxiliary member is not necessarily straightforward. Looking at the revenue generation in the Fazan, we can see that it's evolved mostly through taxation outside of the realm of the state. And this is translated into protection fees and taxes on movement, principally through checkpoints. In an interview in 2018, I spoke to a human smuggler who was bitterly complaining that his journeys from Sebha to Tripoli now took 14 hours rather than 8, purely because of the number of checkpoints he had to go through and pay fees. Also, the tribal nature of many of these groups led to different rates being charged depending on the identity of the person passing through. For example, a Tebu would charge a Tebu a lesser amount than he may someone from another tribe. And of course, with the illicit sector being such a major source of revenue in the South, that was one of the principal things that was taxed and remains being taxed at a much higher rate than anything in the licit sector. The takeaway here for us was really that this has unleashed a vicious cycle whereby increasingly all goods are taxed to move, and there's an increasing amount of predation on all of those goods, which means by the time they reach the market, it's more expensive for everybody. And if you're not then part of those networks, then you essentially lose. So just very briefly in my last minute or so, bringing this back to some broader trends in the current context. So of course, we can see that the oil blockade, in addition to the problems created by the corona crisis response, has antagonized tensions within the GNA alliance. There's an ongoing dispute between Kabir and Siraj over resources and currency devaluation. We've of course also seen an ongoing dispute in the capital over the Ministry of Interior's attempts to reform some of the security sector. And these issues of who runs Libya's semi-sovereign institutions are critical, and armed groups continue to play a major role. And this is something which I think we're continuing to see play out. And I think it's worth watching this space, because clearly the stress of responding to such an emergency is illustrating all of the flaws in the alliance that holds the GNA together. I realize I'm near my time, but just 30 more seconds if I may. I think it's also interesting to see the way that the Libyan Arab Armed Forces has sought to dominate the COVID response in the east of the country. I think, as I said, that indicates the extent to which it sees its role as prevailing over all other actors in the areas under its control. Yet I think just on a policy level, while calls for a CBL board meeting and reunification of the central bank by US policymakers make sense, because there should be a unified response to the corona crisis to mobilize resources. It is certainly true, those that contend in Tripoli, that any resources given to CBL East, any freeing up, essentially measures that prevent the collapse of the Eastern economy, will also be used to mobilize for warfare against Tripoli. So this creates a very difficult situation to manage the economics of Libya's ongoing crisis, while, of course, those funds are increasingly being mobilized for warfare, and while the economy has been dragged increasingly into the conflict. So I'll stop there, Jonathan, for now, if that's okay.
Thank you, Tim. Many questions. Abdul Rahman.
Thank you very much. And I'll be quick and brief and conceptual, rather than going into details, which is what I usually do. So the executive summary of what I'm going to say is that maintaining security in Libya, whether it's in a particular region or whether it's on a national level, is based on the management, central management of socially legitimate armed groups who have the real power on the ground, rather than your traditional essence of a military or security institution that runs a particular area regardless of the social legitimacy. And the social legitimacy of the armed groups is what we wanted to examine. The extent to which an armed group not only reflects the social reality, but also represents its fears and grievances, and whether that statement is still valid till now. So a few obvious statements for me. The armed groups do reflect the social reality, whether it's cosmopolitan in major cities, whereby they represent streets and neighborhoods, whether they represent a family or a group of families, or whether it's a broader clan or tribal. The second one is that the legitimacy, acceptance, and support of the social structures on the ground is critical for the survival of the group and its ability to operate effectively. There are numerous examples of this. So in Misrata, the number of militias in Misrata, it's not a coincidence that it's very similar to the number of families. It's around 280 armed groups, around 280 families. The same thing in the Amazigh areas of the mountains, the same thing in Zintan, the same thing in the south, where armed groups are mainly composed of particular tribes. It's very similar in the east, in particular, in Tripoli, in a cosmopolitan area where really people have identified groups almost more akin to gangs, more akin to being made up of individuals, whereby one could discuss their elimination even militarily by force. But in reality, if you go into the details, you have forces like the Special Deterrence Force, which represents a particular area of Soujuma, Arada. You have the Nawasi, which represents a different area of Soujuma, Shatal and Shir. You have Agnewa, who really gains his social support from Abu Slim, and particularly those from Kikla in Abu Slim. The Tripoli Brigade, really, its membership is composed of people who have a certain amount of sway and power in particular neighborhoods of Tripoli. Without this element, they would not be able to be as effective or survive, even if they're not really as effective. They wouldn't be able to survive. Now, legal legitimacy and technical capability cannot compensate for the loss of social legitimacy, which happened to the formal institutions in 2011. And this is the reason that formal structures, even though they are better trained, even though they are specialized, even though they have the law on their side, even though technically they would have better access to budgets, that they find it difficult to operate in the west of Libya in particular, or in any area for that matter, although the east of Libya have found a formula whereby they've created, centrally created, an amalgam of socially legitimate armed forces and made its composition to look as much like a traditional military as possible, although the social element in the east of Libya is still extremely important. In this context, after 2011, it was up to the individual groups and military councils whether or not to integrate former Gaddafi era military and intelligence and security officers and Gaddafi brigade officers. What we're seeing now, which is kind of what I say is like a reverse DDR, if you look at it in the long term, each militia or each force has managed to integrate specialist intelligence officers, soldiers, and military officers into parallel organizations. These armed groups are really parallel to the state, not directly under their control in the traditional way. And the current conflict, you can see a split, between a conflict between those that refuse to integrate former era Gaddafi era brigades, in particular like Misrata, which really took a very hostile approach, which I don't think was the right thing to do, and between places like Tarhuna, Warshafana, and Zintan, where there is a significant element of the technical fighting force that is composed of former Gaddafi era officers and soldiers. The current war in Tripoli, I analyze it as akin to a significant social split in the west of Libya, between places like Tarhuna, Warfala, Warshafana, who have become anti-GNA, and parts of Zintan, against those that still gain their legitimacy of their armed groups, in particular from the 17th of February revolution in 2011. And therefore, any solution that is presented must be comprehensive. There must be a military element whereby the GNA, there is no choice except for them to be slightly more militarily effective. And it must be social, and it must be political, and it must be economic. There can be a significant international role in this, although the international role at this point in time is either passive or biased. You know, we've seen an injection of technical military expertise, finance, intelligence, logistics, political, and direct action. So the thing I'm going to end on is to say what's possible for now and what's possible to build to gain results in the long term. What is required now? And I'm really, in essence, this would be directed towards some kind of spontaneous political elite that would arrive and present a vision for the state, which really, and Jonathan will know from his experience, is very difficult to find. So I'm just going to talk in an abstract form, regardless of who it's directed at. It's a vision for what we want the country to look like. If we want to focus particularly on the security sector, that's okay. It's about central management, not central control. So decentralization and radical decentralization, economically and politically in security, is essential. And to avoid past mistakes. In the security sector, what does that mean? It means don't build parallel security organizations that are going to cause problems for you in the long term. Now, what do we mean by long term? It's been 9 years since 2011. I was young at that time, not young anymore. In another 9 to 10 years, who are going to be the security and political and social leadership? Who is going to be a colonel in 10 years? Who's going to be a general in 10 years? That's not really something anybody, particularly in the west of Libya, maybe in the east of Libya, they're more addressing that, but in the west and the south, it's not really being addressed. So two concepts that we need to bear in mind. Security and stability as a rent extraction mechanism and a right, which is more about the economics of oil distribution, what the weapon represents, whether that weapon represents a mechanism for that individual to gain a portion of his oil rent, and whether we're talking about security as a technical need. If you're talking about security as a technical need, then there are certain objectives that you can and functions that you can build a professional force out of. At this point in time, security as a technical need, what the citizen requires, what the country requires, what the borders require, is not really being discussed. In reality, security is being discussed and building a security sector and the dispersion of budgets is really being discussed as a mechanism for the distribution of oil rents and for the temporary pleasing of certain elites in the security sector and in armed groups. And that's what I would like to end on.
Thank you. It's really very interesting. It raises an interesting possibility on a vision for a way forward in which you have an integration of the economic and security interests through some integrative mechanism still to be determined. Before we get into that further and questions, we've gotten some really excellent questions from the group, and we have some remarkably knowledgeable people on the call in addition to the panel. I'd like to turn to Jason for his analysis of the paper. Thank you. Jason, you're on mute, so if you could just hit your mute button and unmute, we're ready to go with you. Not yet, still can't hear you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, good, thank you.
Well, good afternoon to everyone in Europe and the Middle East who are watching today, as well as good morning to people here in the States. Thank you so much for joining us. And I want to start by inviting you to actually check out the Chatham House paper that we're discussing, the development of Libyan armed groups since 2014, community dynamics and economic interests. Of course, this has been an impressive piece of research, interview, and analysis of which we can scratch not even the tip of the iceberg. So how does this paper fit into the larger trends of Libya scholarship? And it follows what Tim Eaton, Abdurrahman, and myself have been doing over the past years, which is trying to demonstrate, to my mind, the way in which the root causes of the Libyan conundrum is economic dysfunction. And if you look at economic dysfunction as a root cause, that gives rise to the militias or jihadis or state implosion or the conflict, which are symptoms. Now, my work has tended to focus on analyzing how the dysfunctional Libyan economy works at the top level and interfaces with international actors and diplomacy. This paper takes a different approach. It looks from the bottom up. It shows concrete examples of Libya's conflict economy playing out in the different regions on the ground. So whereas my work has shown what the laws and structures are of the Libyan economy and how that provides the superstructures of dysfunction which allow the militias to exist. This paper gives you the concrete examples of how the armed groups occupy the interstices created by those corrupt structures, and then use extortion, control of banks, roads, tolls, illicit taxation, oil infrastructure, refined petrol smuggling to make money. The paper does so in a way which explains the similarities between the component parts of the LNA, and I prefer that term to the more correct term that Tim used, the Libyan Arab Armed Forces, just because more people tend to know this term LNA. And it shows this paper the similarities between the LNA and the anti-coalitions in the ways they generate funding. So in their investigations of the LNA, Tim and Abdurrahman have shown how rank and file members engage in licit or illicit activities. And they've contributed to the general knowledge, particularly by things that we knew about happening in the coasts, but that are also happening in the southwest and southeast. So for example, loyalty to the LNA can be earned with an acceptance that individuals and groups in question can continue to engage in illicit activities such as smuggling of people, food, and drugs. An interesting example of this earlier today from Tim about road tolls. And I would say this helps us look at Libya as a kind of neo-primordial and neo-medieval situation where merchants are taxed according to their ethnicity and tribal affiliation, as well as the nature of their merchandise. I'll give you an example that I hear about from one of my colleagues. So if you're involved in Libya's illicit gold trade in the south and illicit gold mining, depending on what ethnic group you're in, you have a certain role. In other words, Arabs do certain kinds of transit, but Tebu and sub-Saharan African blacks participate in different roles of illicit gold mining. And this paper shows the ways in which this neo-primordial and neo-medieval reality is playing out at the level of armed groups, semi-sovereign institutions, and then Abdurrahman's great point of how we're seeing security sector reform in reverse. Rather than militias being integrated into post-uprising neutral institutions, what's actually happened is every one of the existing institutions, be they governance or semi-sovereign, has been colonized by communal, militia, and interest groups. So Libya is not an absolutist dictatorship by any means. And yes, it might be most oppressive in the East, but this paper shows you the extent to which civil society and communal actors still function and still push back. The paper highlights some very interesting kinds of protest, repression, dissent, and negotiation, even in the black box of the East. So for example, the LNA's rise has certainly created winners and losers. And the improvement in security in Eastern Libya has led to an increase in economic and business activities. But then this is boomerang with the Military Investment Authority that Tim has mentioned and its predation. But yet people push back. So tribal actors push back against their businesses being subjected to the protection racket of the MIA. But women's civil society groups have pushed back as well. So for example, there was the pretty well-known example in February 2017 when Abdurrazak Nasuri, the military governor of the East and Haftar's de facto #2, issued a directive that women couldn't travel without a guard. And of course, because Libya still has some modicum of and educated civil society and women activists, they protest and they met with Nasuri. They showed him that this was discriminating against, cancel the ban. And that's a great example of ways in which, if you do those you see how armed groups and communities and civil society actors can push back against, different power players, be they militias or LNA leadership. So as my time is coming to an end, I want to highlight, what does this all mean for the seasoned Libyan watching now? We all know that the very font of corruption at the pinnacle of Libya is the CBL. And this war by Haftar to take over Tripoli is his attempt to take the central bank's building by force. Now, of course, it's a year and 3 days since that war was launched. And what do you know? The central bank building has not been taken by force. So now the fight over the CBL has gone to another dimension. And that's the court of international public opinion and not just Libyan public opinion. And that's going to lead to all of these fights going into this legal realm. So I'm going to pause there, and I'd like to give some opportunities in the Q&A to talk about how this can help international policymakers in what they choose to do.
Thank you, Jason. Very helpful. We're going to go now to Megan Doherty, who's going to talk about the humanitarian side of all of this. We are absolutely welcoming your questions, and we'll go straight to them after Megan. A number of the questions have been very interesting. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you so much. So the paper has been well covered, but I'll add a congratulations to Tim and Abdulrahman for a truly impressive achievement. I'm going to focus a bit more in depth on what we're seeing on the ground, given COVID-19 and the more of the humanitarian dimension. So right now we have 19 confirmed cases, including 1 death. There are 307 suspected cases in quarantine, but these numbers are likely significantly higher in reality for 2 reasons. 1, there aren't enough testing kits, and 2, people don't know how to safely access the testing sites amidst an active conflict. So while authorities in the East and West are trying to contain the spread, imposing curfews, closing schools, restricting transit between cities, enforcement is ad hoc and certainly does not apply to the armed groups who continue to move freely and are not social distancing. And all of this is occurring against the backdrop of a conflict that has killed more than 2,000 and displaced more than 150,000 people. So right now there are 3 main concerns. The health system is collapsed and unready for this challenge. The conflict will disrupt humanitarian access and cost lives. And displaced Libyans, refugees, and migrants will be disproportionately affected. Briefly on the health system, even before the virus, the conflict had devastated Libya's health sector. In addition to overwhelming hospitals with war wounded, armed actors have directly attacked clinics, they've killed health workers, and they've bombed and stolen ambulances. In fact, just yesterday, the Ministry of Health announced that a Tripoli hospital was hit by an artillery shell and had to evacuate patients, including suspected COVID cases. Health workers do not have the protective gear that they need to keep themselves safe, and there is a countrywide shortage of hospital beds and ventilators. Tripoli is likely the best stocked with about 100 free hospital beds and ventilators, but this is insufficient and also great compared to other cities. You know, the main hospital in Morzuk has 4 ventilators available, and the doctors there tell us they don't know how to use them. Even worse, this virus is competing for medical attention with an active war. So while the hospital should be training staff and preparing and getting ready for the onslaught, what they're actually doing is being distracted to treat war wounded. Just 2 weeks ago outside Misrata, an attack meant that the hospital had to stop their COVID preparations and treat over 100 injured fighters. And we've seen in this conflict that armed factions have taken over hospitals. And so we're very concerned that this is going to happen more and that we'll see doctors and nurses at risk of assault or kidnapping if they do not prioritize armed groups. Which links to the second point, humanitarian access. Even before the virus, we saw obstructions of humanitarian actors trying to reach people in need. In March alone, there were more than 850 humanitarian access obstructions. 20% of them were related to COVID, and we expect that this number will rise as cases continue to grow. We're also concerned about reprisals against doctors and health officials who speak out to spread information on the virus and also who may be critical of the government's response. This is particularly relevant in the East, where the LNA has reacted harshly to criticism. In late March, a doctor who spoke critically about the government's or about the LNA's response was detained for going on TV and giving his medical opinion. And then in April 1st, Al Nadouri, who we've spoken about previously in this conversation, put out a statement saying that anyone criticizing government COVID efforts would be detained. Anyone you hear criticizing government efforts, consider them a traitor. That's a direct quote. And then finally, COVID-19 will disproportionately affect the people who are already the most vulnerable: displaced Libyans, refugees, and migrants. As I mentioned earlier, more than 150,000 Libyans have been displaced by the fighting. Many of them are sheltering in shared homes where they're unable to self-isolate. And there are thousands of refugees and migrants, particularly from sub-Saharan Africa, who are especially vulnerable, sheltering in makeshift camps where they do not have access to cleaning supplies or testing, let alone basic medical services. And still, there are thousands of refugees and migrants who are in abysmal detention centers who, before the current clashes, were at grave risk of human rights abuses, rape, and torture. So not only do the camps and the detention centers make it very hard to provide safe treatment, they offer the exact conditions that will allow this virus to flourish. Existing diseases, cholera, TB, dirty water, poor sanitation. And since these populations will be the hardest hit, we are very concerned that this will fuel further social discrimination and racism against the refugees and the migrants who will be seen as carriers of the disease. And we're worried that this could be used to incite violence and also deny medical treatment. So in closing, now that I've painted a fabulously sunny picture of the situation on the ground, I will offer briefly a way forward. Make no mistake, it will be impossible to contain this pandemic amidst an active conflict. So the fastest way to save lives in Libya is to work to end the conflict. And I know we'll get into this in the Q&A, but this includes the arms embargo, diplomatic pressure on the warring parties and their backers, considering sanctions and punitive levers. But in the absence of this elusive, lofty peace, we can save lives in the near term. And this includes negotiating humanitarian truces and ceasefires, funding a strong COVID-19 humanitarian response. I believe the UN has asked for 10 million, and applying diplomatic pressure to improve conditions for refugees, migrants, and displaced Libyans. Beyond that, aggressive humanitarian diplomacy from the international community. Through these and other steps, we can actually help avert a humanitarian catastrophe in Libya.
Thank you. A way forward is always really helpful. I'm still shocked when I hear about the bombings of hospitals, as has taken place over the last couple of days in Tripoli, when they're actually bombing healthcare workers, doctors, as well as patients. We have some absolutely excellent questions. I'd like to address them first to the two authors of the study, then to have Jason and Megan add on. I'm going to start with the ones that are economic related before we get to the ones on the humanitarian side. The first question that I'd like to ask is from Jonathan Dart. Give me a moment, I'm going to retrieve it because there are a lot of questions. How much transparency is there on budgets and revenues in the East? How does it compare to what we see in Tripoli? A second question that I'd like to add to that comes from Christopher Blanchard. Can you say more about how different scenarios for central bank unification and the conclusion of an audit might affect the primary coalitions in the East and West? How, if at all, has the dynamic in the East changed for the LNA-LAAF since the CBL has declined to issue further loans to the interim authorities? And then one last question on the economic side. Give me a moment. What is the, this is from Muhammad Ali Abdullah. It's on the integration of security and economic. Abdul Rahman, based on your assessment, which I think is spot on, what's the most sustainable path towards establishing a legitimate, effective security apparatus? Integration into an existing structure, or starting completely from scratch? And I've got a few views on that, but I'm going to hold them for now. Thank you. Tim and Abdul, as you will.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thanks for the kind remarks, Jason, on the paper. In answer to Jonathan Dart's question about transparency in the East, Jonathan and I have discussed on many occasions the almost total lack of transparency within the system across the board in Libya. In fact, the amount of reporting of government expenditure has been woeful across the board. Although, interestingly, there has been some uptick in the reporting of certain issues, particularly from the NOC in response to charges from the LAF that it's not adequately supplying the East, but also the CBL in Tripoli, which has started to report some more numbers. Directly responding to the issue in the East, well, we have heard numbers from the head of the CBL East, if you like, Ali Hibri, on the size of loans that have bonds and loans that have been issued and taken out by CBL East. And I believe, I don't have the figure in front of me, but I believe that's in the region of 34 billion dinars, which is a tremendous amount. And Hibri was also upfront about saying that a third of that had gone to the LAF directly. So that's notable, not indicative of a broader set of transparency. I think it was because he was sounding the alarm of the size of the pot and the amount of money that he was being stretched for. But in the East, the governance system remains woefully untransparent, and the exact route through which the money goes to the LAF is quite murky. So we did a lot of research in the paper looking at the Military Accounts Department, looking at the Military Investment Authority. And here it's worth noting that the Military Investment Authority was based on what I would call a quasi-legal basis because of the disputed nature of many of the institutions that passed the legislation. Actually, the LAF in every case has gone beyond that legal mandate anyway, and really gone very much in terms of certain illicit activities, real estate and other things. So it's not transparent, frankly, and there does need to be increased transparency. This connects to the second set of questions about an audit. I think it's ironic at the moment, actually, that both central banks would not benefit from an audit, in my view. I think that there is plenty that would be embarrassing and could be turned up in an audit, depending on the terms of that audit. But as I understand it, that audit is currently being blocked by the Audit Bureau in the West. So that is the last impediment to getting this audit up and running. Of course, it's a contention from the CBL in Tripoli that that audit is required prior to reunification. There's a healthy debate over the possibility and feasibility of reunification. Some people argue convincingly that it's impossible to reunify a bank when there are two ministries of finance issuing payment orders. But the goal of having one unified budget is a good one. The goal of trying to reduce the bifurcation of institutions and the operation of the state is a very good one. Unfortunately, what we've seen, particularly since the imposition of the oil blockade in January, is that this bifurcation is growing, and I have real fears about the actual bifurcation of the system as a whole, particularly if the East is able to market oil directly. And so that, of course, would undercut and de-emphasize the importance of taking Tripoli, but would also remove the interdependence between East and West in the economic realm. And I see that as a very real and very dangerous potential thing. The other thing is, I think there's a fundamental dilemma on CBL reunification. There is a real risk of economic collapse in Libya. If we look at the numbers of things like money that's been taken out of the commercial banking sector, ostensibly by CBL East, a lot of it for the LAF, then those commercial banks now locked out of the clearance system from Tripoli are struggling to function. So a banking crisis, a banking collapse in the East could cause contagion, particularly when there are no broader incomes coming in. But the danger is, if the West bails the East out and gets them back on the system, is that just going to be more money for Haftar to attack Tripoli? Probably. So it's a very difficult thing to manage. On the one hand, economic collapse, and the other, basically allowing more finances to be mobilized for a set of warring actors. So I'll stop there. I think that's one of the big things at the moment in this CBL spat, which is kind of bubbling under the surface.
Jason?
So obviously there was the third of those questions, which I'll leave for Abdurrahman, but to address Jonathan Dart and Christopher Blanchard's questions, as Tim has pointed out, yes, the East is a black box financially and its budgets are not known, but we know more about them than we used to. On the question of CBL reunification, I think the problem is one of conquest. The Eastern Bank doesn't want unification to mean its conquest by the Tripoli CBL. But what might be happening now with Siraj and the Eastern Board of Directors members worked the HOR and Aguila Saleh, as well as with various internationals, you could see a situation whereby if Sarraj hasn't played his cards correctly, he could get outmaneuvered, and the Easterners, as it were, could colonize the bank. So there's a winner-take-all aspect of what's going on if we allow the structures to exist as they do. So as Tim very rightly pointed out, oh, we can't unify until we have an audit, but we can't have an audit until UNSMIL gets one of the forensic audit companies to do this and blah, blah, blah. And we can't give the papers until it's safe to go to the various bank locations. Those are all excuses. My view, of course, is that this is going to come down to international actors either threatening sanctions, using sanctions, making an international financial commission, transferring who can use the SWIFT codes, and it is escalating to that level. So what does that mean? My view has always been that for too long, international policymakers have thought we can't fix the Libyan economy and its entrenched subsidy system while there's fighting or a pandemic going on. The logic fundamentally has to be turned on its head. The fighting and the pandemic can't be stopped while the subsidy system is going on. And I think all Libyans know this. They're smart, they're savvy, they're well informed. The question isn't who should be the president or the prime minister, but how should the country's vast resources be used and distributed? And that has to do with who the central bank governor is and what he's allowed to do. So that's what this whole conflict is fundamentally about.
Abdul?
Yeah, thank you. I'll answer the security question. I think came in from Muhammad Ali Abdullah. So it's based on a number of principles. I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. The first principle is to build on and integrate into what existed before 2011 in terms of the traditional branches of the armed forces and the reserve law, because there is a reserve military law. You know, the Army, Navy, Air Force, Air Defense, signals, etc. The Ministry of Interior and its traditional police, criminal investigation forces, and the other departments, and the traditional intelligence that existed before, you know, the three main intelligence agencies. The second principle, which builds on what I just said, is based on past experience since 2011, do not build new parallel organizations like what happened and what we did, which I was part of, the Supreme Security Committees, which was kind of like an umbrella organization that integrated militias as groups and kind of really stood in the way of building a functional police force in the Ministry of Interior, and then the Libya Shields and numerous other organizations, including the military councils and the brigades, which were all mandated by the NTC in 2011 and post 2011. Plans for a National Guard. I know the National Guard plans had a lot of international support, but I really don't support anything like the Presidential Guard, for example. I don't really support anything that could compete with and undermine the traditional military and security institutions. However, we do need to build better mechanisms. Those could be councils, it could be regular communication, regular coordination with locally legitimate forces, with brigade commanders, with military councils, with elders, with social councils, with municipalities, etc. But that has to be done by the traditional military and security institutions. The third principle is to integrate as individuals, not groups. The fourth is, in the short term, to have some kind of decentralized local security and military provisions, which really involves the management of arms and ammunition. It would be under traditional structures. There exist geographic commands, the military zones, etc. But those need to be placed under the military and not directly under the president, because that also undermines the construction of a practical military institution. But it needs to come under central standards, central regulation, and central management. In Libya, and Gaddafi knew this very well, it's not about monopoly of force in the Westphalian sense, in the way that we understand in the rest of the world. It's really about the ability of political leadership to manage monopoly of force, to manage forces, communities, that really have their own arms, their own power to provide their own security. It's about the ability to manage that, those social forces. The other thing, which is really the main focus, we should be doing now to really get the results in a few years, is to create not centralized, but professional forces that can implement specific functions, that can have legal legitimacy, that can have technical legitimacy, they can be specialized in particular functions, so that in 5 years' time, those forces are the ones that can have social legitimacy, that are able to operate across regional borders within Libya. The other principle is related to any project that is thought about being conducted now, especially in terms of training military forces. And these are lessons learned since 2011. The international community understood this very well prior to 2014. I remember talking to people from the US, the UK embassy, people like Joe Walker, etc., and they knew this very well. When it comes to training, do not engage in training projects that do not fulfill 3 criteria. The first question is must answer. What is the function going to be performed by the people being trained? Is it clearly stated? Is it clearly designed? The second one, the selection criteria for the individuals. And this is why the GPF project broke down in 2013 and 14 all over the world. The third one is what is the command and control that those people will return to upon the completion of the training. In most training projects since 2011 until now, either 1 out of 3 has been answered or none out of 3 have been answered. And these are really kind of factors to take in mind that will allow the GNA in particular to create something now immediately that doesn't cause destruction in the long term, and that can contribute to a future unification of the military between East and West, which I think has to be done eventually.
I'd like to respond briefly to Abdul Rahman's statement, because what we were trying to do back when I was special envoy was to integrate people who had served in the Libyan military under Gaddafi into a military council, and to have that military council in turn report to the GNA as political matter. It was a vision very similar to what Abdul Rahman has laid out. We made a lot of progress on it. It ultimately cratered on General Haftar being unwilling to participate fully in that activity. He tentatively stepped his toe in a little bit and then pulled it out, took over the Oil Crescent, and then decided and told us he was going to capture Tripoli by the end of 2016. And that was after our elections in the United States. And since then, I think the die has been cast, but it still strikes me as the right vision going forward. I'd like to be able to use the minutes we have left, in addition to any other questions people may have, to go back to Megan Doherty. Given the split between East and West, Megan, and the different powers that are being evidenced by the respective governments, what are the steps the GNA could take to attend to public health right now that they're not taking, given that the war is taking place? What are the steps, besides stopping the war, that the forces in the East could be taking? What are the steps the internationals could be taking to help Libya under the circumstances to combat what is likely to become a public health crisis? We've had some detailed questions on some aspects of that from the group, but I think that's the frame I'd like you to talk to. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. We'll need a whole separate hour for this, I assume. I do want to start with one word. I keep reflecting that if all of those foreign backers providing armed groups in both sides with military support could just divert that to equipping hospitals, Libya would be fine. And it's really hard not to keep that in mind as we think about the current picture. In terms of where the international community is, we have seen some encouraging initial steps, but it is a reality that every country is more focused on its own domestic situation, and that Libya is not a second order, maybe a little bit of a third order priority. But that said, in terms of the encouraging steps we've seen, the US government has announced an initial $6 million towards fighting COVID in Libya. The actual funding needs will likely be much, much higher, but this is a really encouraging initial step and will allow the US to try and burden share and leverage contributions from other parties. But what we need right now, beyond the very technical things, which are supplies, protective gear for the health workers on the front lines, more testing kits and equipment and basic capacity. So, because we do need all of those, but what we really need are attention to resolve the inherently political dimensions of this conflict that will make containing and defeating the pandemic impossible. So that is renewed international attention towards resolution and towards humanitarian ceasefires that will allow humanitarian actors to treat the wounded and to train up public health professionals who will be the first responders when the numbers start to peak. So while there are technical needs, and happy to detail more of those in the chat box, the broader need here is not actually medical, it's political.
Comes back to politics, comes back to money, comes back to security, and now comes back to humanitarian. The four of them all do kind of intersect. I would invite additional questions from those who are still with us, which is most people.
Yeah, and Jonathan, you did ask about the Libyan government response.
Please.
And I'll say that the GNA has allocated and announced, I believe, about 575 million Libyan dinars that are intended to go to municipalities to help them in their fight against COVID. I will note on the economic front, in general, to defeat a pandemic, you need unified, credible public health authorities to communicate essential information to people about how to stay safe and how to stay healthy. And both sides, I would argue, are suffering from what I'll generously describe as credibility challenges and low public opinion, which means that people don't know what information to trust and how to access what they need to keep their families safe. So there is an opportunity, however unlikely here, but there is an opportunity for authorities to practice some of the proactive transparency that Tim and Abdulrahman were talking about and try and rebuild public confidence to strengthen the overall COVID response.
In the United States, funding for the recent CARES Act includes funds to create a single unified website to include all COVID information of a governmental nature to try and collect literally everything in one place. If the GNA were to do even some portion of that, it would likely help the GNA quite a lot, I would think. We've had questions in addition about how the crisis and COVID could create opportunities for terrorist groups, including Islamic State. I want to just add that into the questions, but I'd like to turn to Tim, to Abdul, to Jason, and to Megan for any last thoughts in the 3 or 4 minutes we have left. Tim.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for this discussion. I think Megan's point there about, of course, what you need, the best solution to all of Libya's ills is a political settlement, and combining that really with the comments that Jason made, saying that, okay, well, we do need that settlement, but we don't wait for everything to happen until that settlement is reached. There are things that can be done. There are moves that can be made. There are agreements that can be sought if the actors are willing to be proactive and engage in good faith. I do see some potential from the Libyan Expert Economic Commission run by the UN here. I know that there are a lot of good ideas which are being put forth. And frankly, I think that the level of expertise within that group and the ability to formulate policy responses which can be implemented is sorely needed right now. I hope that in this current phase, that those ideas will still be pushed forward, ways in which workarounds for budgets, workarounds in which resources can be mobilized to address the conflict. Of course, though, those things aren't resolvable whilst hospitals are still being bombed. I would reiterate the calls for diplomacy on this issue. The one thing, unfortunately, that we haven't seen up until now and continue to fail to see is any drawback from the international backers of these respective coalitions. And unfortunately, that increased commitment we've even seen since the COVID pandemic worsens all of these trajectories and makes it harder to be constructive in policy engagement. So I hope that there can be some pressure at some point, and it does have to, questions do have to be asked at that level. As long as these backers continue to engage in the way that they are, it's hard to put forth really actionable policy initiatives within Libya.
Jason?
Well, I think we need to be honest with everyone. It's going to get worse before it gets better. And that's the same with the pandemic globally as with the Libya conflict. arms have been coming in since the Berlin conference at a surprising clip. And under the cover of night, as it were, we are seeing Libyan actors, both political, economic, and militia, do even more foul deeds than they would have otherwise, because the global attention is elsewhere, and that's not going to change. The global attention is going to be inward directed. Every major nation is focused on its own COVID issues. So if the Emiratis or the Turks think that this is a time that they can gain an advantage by shipping more armaments or trying to make a power play against the bank or make a power play in this way, that's going to go on. However, every great crisis is a great opportunity. And just as the COVID crisis globally is an opportunity to create things like universal healthcare in America, or to deal with the way in which states and the federal government interact in a better way, there's a huge opportunity for the COVID pandemic in Libya to deal with the way in which communities, their militias who come from those communities, and things like the GNA, the LNA, and the international community, to have them coordinated in something like the central institutions, but decentralized playing out command that Abdurrahman said, to create real structures that work, to create the economic system that works for all Libyans and solves the need to try to conquer institutions to get more corrupt gains. So there is a great opportunity, but it's going to get much worse before it gets better.
Thank you. Final words from Megan, Abdul, and then we're going to have to sign off. Everyone has the opportunity to ask additional questions for chat, for response afterwards from any of the panelists. Please feel free to take advantage of it. Megan, and then Abdul to close us out. Thank you.
Sure, I'll be brief. So Libya's trajectory is not great. As Jason says, it will get worse before it gets better, but how worse it gets is still in play. And it's important to not give up and recognize that there actually are steps that we can take right now to minimize further loss of life. And that includes working towards a political settlement, as we discussed, and also the issue of humanitarian diplomacy. So standing up against those who block humanitarian access and demonstrating consequences for those who violate international humanitarian law, which has been happening since the start of this conflict, but is only going to escalate now. Beyond that, engaging with the parties and their foreign backers on civilian protection and humanitarian access, and ensuring protective equipment and essential medical supplies get to the hospitals and clinics that need them most. And then finally, investing in protection for the most vulnerable. That means partnering with the UN, with the World Health Organization, with IOM, and with civil society to ensure that refugees, migrants, and displaced Libyans have access to the essential services and protection that they need.
Thank you. Abdul?
Thanks. So I'm a realistic optimist. So I'm optimistic if the right things are done. It's difficult to be optimistic if bad decisions keep on being made. Having said that, there are a lot of opportunities. Now, what I predict will happen is that there's going to be a global blind eye for the next few months. And I think the players on the ground are going to take advantage of it to escalate. Funnily enough, I think, my personal opinion only, with the existence of Turkey in play, the most effective and fastest way to a compromise solution, a negotiation, a ceasefire, some kind of beginning of political negotiation, is a slight increase in GNA, military effectiveness on the ground, plus military organization. I think those two factors would open the avenue of negotiation with the other side. The other opportunity that I see is on two things: counterterrorism and corona. All the data indicates, all the intelligence indicates that Africa is going to be the next big place for many extremist groups, many armed terrorist organizations to be operating. Libya has an opportunity to play a role in this, and they are going to be using Libya as a logistical launching ground. They are going to be using Libya to get funds. They are going to be using Libya to recruit. They are using Libya at this point in time by a number of elites. Whether they're going to be able to get to a stage to control territory as ISIS did before, it's not necessary for them to do that in order to be effective. It's very important to understand. Counterterrorism and coronavirus are two issues that there could be cooperation between East and West, regardless of whether the war continues or not. These are universal issues that affect everybody. At the absolute minimum level, there should be much better information sharing mechanisms on counterterrorism and coronavirus between East and West. At the next level, there should be shared resources. If the GNA have extra funds, they should be sending it to the East and the South. These are issues that affect everybody. There's an opportunity there to really create goodwill, at least among the population, to say, okay, there is a war going on, but the levels of hate are getting out of control. And at the end of the day, we don't want anybody to be getting ill. Now, a lot of the issues that we're talking about, they're a result of poor management and poor political will. And Jonathan knows this very well. I'm sure he's been very frustrated dealing with them for years. And I think he would agree with me. Those two issues are things that I see an opportunity to solve if there is an improvement in management of resources, of institutions. Particularly, I'm really pointing a lot of my criticism at the GNA at this point in time. If there is some kind of effective social pressure to increase political will, then possibly there could be some kind of positive outcome. Otherwise, in reality, there could be perpetual instability for years to come. It's been 9 years since 2011. In another 9 years, I don't know how old I'm going to be. And it's likely it's going to look the same if we don't start taking some kind of action. Thanks.
Thank you. This was fascinating. I thank everyone for joining us at the Middle East Institute. I thank the Middle East Institute for putting together the technology and support to get us all on today. The paper is worth spending a lot of time with. I'm going to be spending more time with it this week. A tremendous amount there. Again, thanks to all. This was very interesting and useful, I think. Until next time. Bye-bye.